I would imagine you're not looking at this video until after spring break, so I hope you had a nice one, and that you're well and safe, and that you're ready to sprint towards the finish line of your graduation. Like exam one, exam two will have 40 multiple choice questions. 32 of the questions are drawn directly from the exam banks. 8 of the questions are questions that I've written that derive from the slides. And so I will go about giving you a quick review. Chapter 5, there are only about 5 questions in the exam on Chapter 5. The rest of them have 8 to 9 questions, so not as much material here. It's going to be important that you cue on the idea of resource similarity and market commonality and understand what that's likely to do to response tendencies. Likewise, make sure you reread the section of the chapter about the likelihood of attack and the likelihood of response. It's going to be very important that you can distinguish between a tactical action and a strategic action on the exam. Everything on this slide is true. There's one thing I want to clarify because I don't want you to miss an exam question. In general, when firms have a lot of multi-market contact, they tend to de-escalate their activities. In other words, they just don't tend to attack each other. That said, if they do attack each other, then they are likely to respond because they feel like they can't let you get away with it. It's not something they can afford to go unchecked, because then you'll just continue to do it in other markets. There are questions about first versus second mover. Even though I believe in one of the questions there's a comment about market speeds, that is not something that I really emphasize, so don't worry about that. And then just look over this and be somewhat familiar. We had a good discussion of it in class. And I don't think there's any test questions directly from this slide. That will wrap up the Chapter 5 review. As for Chapter 6, this slide is going to key you in on several important concepts that will lead to test questions. Even though the exam is not going to use the term the better off test, remember that the ultimate question about a corporate strategy is why the entities are worth more combined or in the same company they would be in another company. Also, make sure you're all over the concept of synergy, and think about my story about Pirate's Treasure. Very important that you understand to be able to spot economies of scope that may trigger you into what kind of diversification strategy that's being used. So be familiar with what economies of scope are and what they entail. However, remember this idea of related constrained, related linked. Don't need to worry about that. You will need to be able to spot unrelated diversification. No specific questions on the stories about P&G and GE. Important that you understand what vertical integration is, both forward and backward. And also that you understand what pooled power can be, although I think that's really going to be more helpful, an alliance question. Make sure you understand what unrelated diversification is, be able to spot it, and understand the advantages with it. And I believe that is everything for Chapter 6. Next up is Chapter 7 with mergers and acquisitions. There's going to be some important terms on this slide. Know that a merger is a relative co-equals, and also know that that's why true mergers don't happen very often, because usually one firm dominates the other. Not important that you remember these per se. I won't test you on them, but they can also help you understand. Remember that I talked about this a lot in the class, which is not the way the textbook teaches. It's not that I disagree with the textbook, it's that I explain the material a little bit differently than the textbook does. And I talk about these types of mergers and acquisitions. Remember, consolidation would be, if we go back to this slide, a consolidation would be all of these airline consolidations or all of these beer consolidations. The best one right now is the Cabela's and the Bass Pro. M&As is extensions. The best example of that would be perhaps Haier's purchase of GE Appliances, or Microsoft's purchase of Mojang, where they already have a gaming division, but this gives them something new in the gaming division. And then mergers and acquisitions is entrepreneurship. That would be like Google's purchase of Android, which they later turned into the software that we're all aware of, or Facebook's purchase of Oculus Rift to get into the virtual reality space. Make sure that you're familiar with each of these M&A types and be familiar with what typically goes with them, and if you will, the economic logic of them. So extensions and consolidations are important. I don't think there's a question on entrepreneurship, but um, it still might help you spot the differences between other things. Know the steps, particularly pay attention to due diligence, how it goes right and how it goes wrong. Um, there are a couple of questions on why mergers and acquisitions don't work well. Certainly, a couple of them or a couple of issues focus on the price and what typically goes wrong when you overpay, which gets into this section as well. Nothing directly out of this chart. And then we talked about restructuring. And so you're going to want to be familiar with this part of the book. There's a good question on what type of firm is going to be most likely to be successfully acquired and restructured. And I think that is it for Chapter 7. For the exam, on the issue of global strategies, there are a couple of key points that I asked several questions about. Make sure you understand the difference between a global, transnational, and multi-domestic strategy. And again, all of these slides help you understand them very well, and you're going to be asked to pick between them. In class, we had an excellent discussion about when to concentrate manufacturing versus distribute manufacturing. That's one that is going to be asked about on the exam. Then we talked about the various ways that you enter a foreign market or a global market, and there are several questions that come out of this chart, so make sure you're familiar with all of the different entry strategies. There is discussion of the risks, so be familiar with the difference between a liability foreignness, a political risk, and the economic risk. And there's also a question as to whether somebody is going to want a strong or weak dollar, and it's not so much a dollar, it's just the home currency. And I believe, I'm just looking down to make sure, that will tackle everything in our global chapter. Remember for alliances that the basic logic is to build these sorts of things. And even though they can create economies of scope, they can also, if you do the right sharing of resources, they can also contribute, they can develop or create economies of scale. These are all the reasons for cooperative strategies. If you remember, I talked about these map very well onto the benefits for mergers and acquisitions, but very importantly, sometimes it doesn't have some of the negatives of an M&A. Be very familiar with how a joint venture is different than an equity alliance, is different than a non-equity alliance. A couple of questions that will come off of this chart. As we get into these charts, this is a chart that you're just going to need to understand, and there's several pages in the textbook that talk about this. And this is also something that you're going to want to understand. And again, it's described well in the textbook. A couple of things that we're not going to have on the exam, specifically a network alliance. And then we talk about what goes wrong in alliances. So this is something that you're going to want to look at. Make sure that you understand opportunistic behavior and how it differs from these kinds of issues. And then also remember our discussion about conflict in an alliance. I'm making this before we actually have this class, but we'll have a good discussion on that. And then look at this and look at the ways that you make the alliance a success. And so this is something you're going to want to commit or concentrate on. Also, there is a question about cost minimization versus opportunity maximization. So make sure that you understand that. And I think that'll do it. Well, wait, a key component here is that alliance has a lot of good things, but it does involve a loss of control. So that's an important illustration that will help you on the exam. That's it for the review. Unlike exam 1, exam 2, you are going to have a Globus decision round after you complete the exam, so be ready for a busy day. Good luck.